My name is Dieter Brunt. I was the project architect for Freedom Park Phase 2. I started this project at Design Concept in 2006. I worked for Office of Collaborative Architects, which is a collaboration between 3 companies based in Johannesburg. It's Mashibani Rose Architects, Gap Architects, and MMA Architects. I principally worked with Jeremy Rose throughout the process, although we were in fact autonomous to the 3 particular offices. So we had a office in 44 Stanley Avenue, which was quite nice because it meant that our actual working environment was quite free, and we had a fantastic team of about 5 or 6, 7 of us. It grew and expanded as the project went along. So the name of Phase 2, which is really the museum and the archive, is Bapo. And Bapo in San means a dream is not a dream until it's dreamt by the community. We had a standing joke in the office that a design is not a design until it's designed by the committee. So this is really where it all started. It was initially adopted by Thabo Mbeki. He took the project on really as his project, and in some ways also as a project as part of the sort of African Renaissance. But the site in question is Selkop, and it's strategically located as you enter into Pretoria from the N14. And on the one side you've got the Pochaka Monument, on the other side you've got, well, from the hillside you can see the Union Buildings. Selkop is currently under a urban design framework that's been developed as part of the master framework for Pretoria. I believe Arab are doing that. And currently its connectivity is one of the constraints that it has, and the question is how to really connect back into the city. But what you see here is the site before it was developed. And you can see the old Selkop village, which is a Transnet rail village, which has a lot of heritage value, in fact. And the initial servicing of the site for the old reservoir, you can see the ring road. And at phase 1, the first phase for Selkop was in fact the servicing of the site. So the ring road was developed, as well as the required water lines and electrical lines, etc. In the beginning, all human beings emerged from the reeds and spread and multiplied in earth. I think what we see when we approach the city is the reeds, are the reeds, and they're really taken from the African story of creation. And there's a large thematic that imbues Freedom Park, which is really taken from current indigenous knowledge systems. And in this instance, it's really humans that develop from the water, from the reeds. That's just a quick location plan. You can see where Freedom Park is located with the city. Freedom Park, it is a park, and I like to think about a park in terms of having a spatial narrative with experiential design. So as you move through the park, you have the various elements that then continue this narrative as well as the spatial experience. And this just shows you the old Selkop village, and you can see the first element, which is Bapo, which I'll talk about at length, and then you've got what is known as a spiral pathway that links up to Esplivani and makes the way up into the hill, where you've got the Wall of Names, the Sanctuary, and the Hall of Leaders. So for reeds to come out of the ground requires a little bit of construction. This is an early image of the civils and the foundations and the retaining walls coming out on the top of the hill. I mean, I must say personally, you know, without the national heritage around Freedom Park, I quite like the hill. You know, there's always this issue whether one actually keeps something natural or not. But you can see the very first element that was put on to Freedom Park, which is Isivivani. And that was in fact a particular site that's chosen on the east of the hill by the traditional healers. They found a site of power, and that was seen as the resting place for the souls of people that had died throughout the struggle of South Africa. And it's a place where they get brought home and they can actually rest. Each of the boulders were selected from the various provinces by the political leaders or the spiritual leaders and the people. And those selected rocks were then brought back and put into a circle. Why I emphasize that is that the boulder theme is a theme that comes out within the project, and particularly with the local. It's important to notice once we've actually found a resting place for the souls, that there's something that actually memorializes, that gives a physicality to the people that died, and that's what the Wall of Names is. And I think the importance of also accepting the history of South Africa, of course. And the selected site complements the Voortrekker Monument. And even though we had a lot of politics getting to where we are today, we now finally have a road that connects between the Voortrekker Monument and Freedom Park. So, Voortrekker Monument, which is one of the most visited sites in fact in South Africa, is now supported by Freedom Park. So visitors to the monument can then come into Freedom Park and vice versa. Thabo Mbeki, you know, I mean, just starting from 2006, in fact met him 2 years ago, and we had the president of Burundi here and he was taking me on a tour. This was after he'd been ousted from government. He's quite an intellectual. I think Freedom Park wouldn't really be where it is today without his will and his drive. And at an early stage, just to give you an idea of who actually managed Freedom Park, it started with this initiative, and I think there was arts and culture early up, and then there was a Freedom Park Trust, which was founded and had to dissolve after a certain date. So today it's called the Freedom Park. And whilst Freedom Park Trust was running, it had some connection with the Department of Arts and Culture. Following that, Transnet has now ceded the land to the Department of Public Works, and the Department of Public Works has taken over Freedom Park as its under its portfolio. But that said, there's still issues around the establishment of the township. The township hasn't been proclaimed because Transnet's property has been given over to Selvacorp, and now Selvacorp is falling under the mandate of the new master plan. So therefore, we are actually still in between, and effectively the land still belongs to Transnet, etc. But Freedom Park are now still managing the site under the auspices of the Department of Public Works. From boulder to building, the boulders which form the basic concept for the design of the temple resonate with several traditional African ideas and with the site itself, which has rock outcrops, ridges and boulders present. The hard landscape surfaces which surround the building have been gently shaped to echo the boulder forms of the building and to extend the boulder theme into the landscape. Now, just a little bit of history. We started the design process. We initially had a draft brief from Think, which are a New York-based exhibition consultant team. They in fact designed 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York, which is now completed. And we had started to resolve the actual planning of the project, but for some time, whilst we had the politics playing out and the budget seemed to be going back and forth, they didn't appropriate the original design concept. And you know, we really had our budget cut in half and then expanded again, and this was directly linked to what was going on in government at the time. So why I mention that is that at a later stage, there was a particular site visit to Creda Mutwa's traditional homestead in Kuruma, and the client had insisted on this visit as part of trying to develop this brief in light of the emancipation of the African voice. And this is Creda Mutwa's healing garden, and there are very particular rocks as very specific indigenous knowledge systems around plants that have some agency in terms of healing. And it is from this site visit that Jeremy Rose did a particular sketch that really gave form to our project. That's the sketch. And so when we look at the very first ideas of Isivivani, we see how the boulder thematic comes through, and there are many different references in traditional African cultures with boulders, as if it's a resting place for the spirits, or if it has healing qualities, etc. And it comes also directly out of the African story of creation, which is really where you start seeing the very first elements coming out like a reed. So we go from Creda Mutwa's boulders in the healing garden, and we look at a couple of rocks on site, and you see a later image of a fissure in one of our boulder forms. And just to give you a sense of scale, there you can see somebody's resting, and you've got the artistry with copper, which Frans worked on, and then here you have the internal one. I'll talk about this stigma as we move on. The question around an exhibit narrative, just to bring back what the museum's task is as an element within the various elements of the park, is that it really is there to tell the story of South Africa through an exhibition narrative. One of the themes in terms of like how to position the exhibit content within world's best practice is like, where are we in terms of exhibition? And the one thing is to concern oneself with the oral component, which is really more speech related, and it's really seen as a social artifact. So the idea of storytelling is reinforced throughout the experience, and in particular it adds gravitas to the project, where the idea is that we have a living archive where the ingestion between the public and the people, the actual storytellers on site, is merged, and that when people visit the site and they have their stories, that information can get ingested, taken into the archive, and then returned back into the exhibit experience. This was one of our last models. We did a series of models. Balsa wood. You can see the site plan developing a little bit, and the landscaping. In fact, that portion of the site there was initially not part of our site, and we had some areas with the STP plan, issues with parking, and then amended the original township plan to include that, but in the meantime that's dissolved because this thing is going to become much larger. The idea of how does Freedom Park connect to the city or to Salvatore was of great concern, and it is fenced. It does have a security line around it. Question about Freedom Park and freedom, one could ask those questions, but I think the idea is to then have outreach programs which facilitate people coming in from schools, from the rural areas, etc. But we certainly looked at trying to integrate a space that is on the outside of Freedom Park, which is a public space, a site of protest, 24/7, where people can utilize that. You'll see that in the landscape from today. Although the master plan might adapt that, there are a lot of various interests that have been vying for the land in Salvatore, especially a lot of the government departments. We got correctional services, we had Stats SA that were trying to develop about 70,000 square meters of land or bulk, which I think in the meantime might have dissolved, but every headquarters would like to have a seat. In fact, I think Arts and Culture wanted to be somewhere on top of the hill at a point. But the idea is that this acts as a gateway, and we have a public square, and then you do cross the line into the actual park itself. This was just one of many iterations earlier of an overlay of the original GAP urban framework. This was an image just starting to indicate the qualitative landscaping developed by the landscape architects. And all the planting is indigenous. I don't believe, well, not necessarily indigenous to the hill. There was environmental management plan that protected a lot of the species on the hill, in particular portions of that hill that are more sensitive than others. These were sections done by our office. There's this question about the sectional experience, the spatial experience that one has as a visitor. And the concept of content-informing container was quite important. In the early stage we had worked with the exhibit designers, although I think they fell off the track at some stage because the content was taking longer to develop. There was a lot of buying in terms of what is the narrative. So there's a bit of politics behind it. That took long, but at the initial stage we had worked with them, and what we tried to do was establish in each of the bolded forms the qualitative experience that reflected that particular epoch. And when I say epoch, there are these various epochs that have been designated, starting from land, moving to ancestors, peopling, after there was colonization, urbanization, industrialization, nationalism struggle, and then looking beyond into the future, nation building. But how does one distinguish between those? So we had these experiences. So for instance, if you walked into ancestors, your experience was, in terms of the cosmology, a vertical experience, quite compressed vertically. And then you would go through a compression experience. The compression would often allow for guerrilla gatherings to come in, which is a temporary gathering experience, or just relief. But that then allows for the change, the revolution from one epoch to the next epoch. And later you'll see in the boulder forms, which are, I might add, cavernous from inside, just to pick up the original hierarchy of the boulder concept. So we have these cavernous forms, but then within that begins to reflect each of the epochs. You go through the compression spaces, and it's not all that obvious, and some of it could be seen as tenuous, but I mean, for instance, at industrialization and urbanization, you'll start seeing, we start putting exposing the structure, the forms start getting a little bit more rigid, and eventually when you get to nation building, you see that this experience is a lot lighter. The copper, the coloring is very important in terms of the material choice, and you'll see that we used a coral brick. I think it was classical blend, and we use it on the surface, and that begins to fold into plinth forms as a base for the copper structures. But that red brick is pulling Selkirk Village into Freedom Park. It's part of the connection between the city and Freedom Park. And then you've got the copper. And then inside you use the rosewood, and that often denotates the vertical circulation, and when you want to see there's a root or a fissure or a spot, this is really the colouring of the building. I've just collapsed all the plans into one image. We've got 4 primary levels. We've got 1383, which is the arrival square. That's the base. It's on a north-facing public square. That's where you start, but you go through the garden space, and then you go through the experience, and when you drop down vertically, you end up back in this north-facing square. We then move so that one would have moved around through the garden, and then you enter at 88. Now that's 87. That would be the public floor level for with the kitchen serving out into the canteen, the restaurant that then breaks out eastward looking over into the garden. And you've got some smaller temporary spaces, seminar room, and that's the library component that connects to the Pan-African Archive, which is a building. You'll see a red brick building, which is mostly administration and archive. That was part of the value engineering, but cut out and brought back in. But acts as a binary, which complements the actual exhibit experience. So we go back to the start, the orientation hall, and that's where we are in the entry space, which is seen as the orientation space. There's normally a little bit of a storyline that's just behind us here, where visitors can come in and get an overview of the whole of Freedom Park. In fact, you can see our model, the one that I showed in the slides, that's at the back there. So the idea is that visitors come in here, they orientate themselves, they get a plan layout of the entire building and as well as the entire park. And then they would begin their experience by moving through up this ramp into land. And then we move through the various epochs and we end on that side. So we'll be going through each of the boulder experiences. You're going to see some of the exhibition that's being prepared for the public as we speak. There was, I believe, a target date for September. My guess is that's going to be, there will be an opening around December the 16th. You can see the exhibit designers taking ownership of the space. I mean, the earlier images, we had a lighter colors and audio experience that happens in here, quite dark. And then we would move towards ancestors. This is now a slightly more vertical experience. We're now moving from level 88, which was on the orientation. We've moved up a meter and a half, and then we're moving up towards 90, and then eventually 92.
vertical skin closing to the underside of your roof. So that's the seal line, and then you can see that above the structure, the pillared structures, you can begin to see the acoustic and insulation boards. Well, I went to, but this is the canteen area, and there's the idea that there's a bit more fine dining eventually, and that the dining operates after hours. So it's a question of access. People can enter from the square.
These were early model developments, and you can see this is where we were. There were a number of changes that happened. You know, we flipped the plan at some point. But what's interesting to note is that the Boulder concept, once we had a sketch, it was very easy to make, you know, for us. Very easy to drive the design in a particular direction, and you can see the development of the forms towards more or less where we are today. It is important to note though that once we made that shift, that the actual planning wasn't a major shift. All our adjacencies were in place, you know, so it became a formal thing. It was a content informed the content. You can see, just from a construction perspective, the first thing we do is we cut the hill. There's retaining walls, surface beds, maybe suspended slabs with some concrete column system. But when it comes to making all the forms, we've got a portal frame. The secondary frame applied that gives the form, and then inside we have an additional internal secondary frame that allows us to give the cavernous formation. So what you see there is the steel structure. Now, we did our designs with the models, but it wasn't something that we could compute directly. We then took the model and cut it into a series of sections, and we then gave the sections to the engineers, and the engineers then would take that information together with the elevations, and they sent it to the steel subcontractor. The steel subcontractor then actually modeled 3D the whole structure again. So you could probably argue that there's a system to collapse that, but we were working kind of with our formal models and then extrapolating that into CAD, and then from CAD back to the engineers back to the subcontractor formalize that again. Now you could probably find that we could collapse that system today with other systems, but that's the way we did it. And I think we were privileged with time. We had, whether it was the project being put on hold or, you know, the client decision taking a long time, it gave us the opportunity to develop the form of the project. And there are no straight lines, as you can see. You can see the sheen of the copper once it's applied in the beginning, and you can already see the patina that's starting to happen, the aging of the copper form. So the aerial shots, interesting to note the site, you know, the red earth. I mean, that is another thing, is that the red comes from on the site, and the choice of brickwork, the copper and the rosewood were belonging to the site. We've embedded a lot of different forms, or, I mean, you won't really see that well over here, but for instance, in the courtyard we've got whales that are swimming in the water, so the boulders begin to float a little bit, or there's an elephant on the one side. It's like a Noah's Ark, but that's a quiet thing that just gets put in. Client doesn't know about it, principal architects don't know about it, you do it. This is interesting because that fissure, that very bold fissure that happens on the north-facing boulder F, we had to mark each of our boulders A, B, C, D, E, F. We did with various systems that we designed. But that is expressing nation building. It's a future boulder. It's the breaking off of the one epoch to the next epoch. Whereas the other ones are more established, they're settled. This is suggestive of what happens into the future. And it's that particular fissure that looks back to the Union buildings, to the seat of power, to the seat of government, what's happening into the future. I mean, that's not. This image is interesting. What we did in order to show the weathering of the boulders is that when you push, when we start to push for openings, and the boulder begins to exfoliate or break or open up, is that we have generally a standing seam, copper-clad exterior, and then when we push, we have shiplap on the interior. The horizontal line, it's softer. So whereas the boat's rising out of the ground, the other one's pushing and weathering. We had to develop our system. You know, I mean, I've worked in 1 or 2 offices before, and there's always this issue, which system do you use? And we kind of had to find a system as we went along, because you've got all these hundreds of different elements, facades, partitions, services, electrical, electronic, lighting. For a museum, it's quite complicated. I think, you know, exhibit designers probably want a black box, so it's trying to weigh up the ideal exhibition space with the concept. Window schedules, and then something straight. This is the building requires you know, wayfinding and escape routes, and safety, security. This rosewood is expressing the primary vertical circulation that allows the visitors to complete their exhibit experience, and compresses right at the bottom as you go through from 92 to 87 and then down to 83, where you then open up into this north-facing square. That's the restaurant level, the public floor. Okay, I think that's more or less it. I thought I'd throw something right in the end. I'm not sure if I should, but I was wondering what would happen if you collide 2 worlds. It's a project I did a couple of years ago. Okay. Thank you.